Hi, so today I'm going to talk to you about climate smart agriculture and how it plays into Costa Rica's carbon neutrality goals for the future. To begin with, I'm going to start with what is climate smart agriculture, and that's going to be the first part of this lecture. The second part is going to be how Costa Rica can use it to achieve its goals in becoming carbon neutral. So let's start by taking a look at this map. This map here shows us the estimates of how yields are going to change according to climate change projections by 2080. And everything that you see in green are places where the climate is going to change in such a way that agricultural yields are actually going to get better. You can see Canada, northwestern United States, Finland, Mongolia, all of Russia, most of Europe, they're going to be getting better yields. And that's because the climate is going to get warmer and the growing season is going to increase. Actually, places like Russia and Canada are going to suddenly get this new arable land that used to be frozen all the time, and it's going to be good for producing food. So that is good for these countries. However, the rest of the map, where you can see all the red and orange and yellow, mostly in the tropics, that's places where yields are going to go down. They're estimated to go down. And the reason is that the warmer climate is going to just affect the way that we grow crops. The problem is that these are the countries where most of the population of the world is growing. The higher growth rates of population are happening here. And this is where food is going to be needed the most. And many of these countries are a lot poorer than the ones in northern latitudes, so they might have more trouble adapting. In response to this, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations came up with climate smart agriculture, which it's its way of using technology, existing technology, and trying to transfer it to countries where this is going to be needed the most. We're anticipating these changes. So these changes are already happening, but we haven't gotten to the really hard changes. We need to get prepared for that in the tropics. And the idea of climate smart agriculture is to use the technology that we already have and emerging technologies as well, but not keep them at a level where it's just discussed in universities or highly technological countries, but rather getting it to the ground to the farmers who really will be needing these, which are the farmers in tropical countries. Now, when we say farmers, we don't mean just small farmers. Climate smart agriculture can apply to anything from industrial, large scale farms for profit, like pineapple farms, or to the small farmer who has their own little integrated coffee farm with pigs and chickens and all these things. So it's a very broad concept, and we're going to look at what the principles are behind it. It's based on three pillars: productivity, adaptation, and mitigation. And I'm going to go through these individually so we can get a little bit more detail on that. Productivity means that we need to change farming, but we can't forego the profitability of it for the farmers. The ability, we cannot undermine the ability of these farmers to make a living. We can't just say, hey, you should use these techniques because that's good for the atmosphere, but oh, sorry, you're not going to be able to feed your family. We need to make something that is not just keeping their profitability, but actually making it more profitable for them. That's the way that people mostly react when they see also an economic benefit beyond just the abstract benefit of benefiting the whole atmosphere and the whole world climate system. So we also want to make sure that by increasing this profitability, we're not undermining the environment of these that these farmers depend on as well. What tools can we use for this in climate smart agriculture? Well, the application of new technologies is at the forefront. And what technologies can these be? Machinery, new types of fertilizers, genetic engineering, new techniques, the application of satellite images, you name it. Anything that can save money and increase productivity in the farm is better for climate smart agriculture. This brings us to the concept of sustainable intensification. One of the ideas of the farming is that we should start sparing some land and just making the agricultural land that we already have more productive. One of the big sources of emissions uh, farming in general for agriculture is just clearing of forest and releasing all that carbon stored in forests in favor of converting it to pastures or farmlands. If we can take the farms that we already have and keep the nutrients there and make them more profitable, there will be less demand for expanding our agricultural frontier. And transferring technology can go a long way. Like, there's a lot of things that small scale farmers don't have, but they could have, like drones, for example. Drones used to be very expensive, and nowadays you can get a drone for $1,000. So a few farmers could get a good drone, get trained in how to use it to monitor their crops, and make it more profitable instead of having to do these monitoring on by foot over large areas of land. And finally, also integrated pest management is one of the main uh, tools that we can use for increasing productivity. Right now, farmers depend on a lot on pesticides, which are not good for the environment. However, the cost of them is also very significant, and this makes farmers in small developing countries more dependent on external outputs because they don't produce these things. You need to buy them from a large producer like Monsanto to put it into your fields. Integrated pest management is knowing the ecology of the pests and using all techniques that are not based on chemicals before actually requiring the use of agrochemicals. So note that climate smart agriculture is not against pesticides and not against synthetic fertilizers, but it's in favor of reducing them and using them as little as possible in order to maximize profits and reduce the impacts. Adaptation is what we do to manage the effects, the uh, how we would say that the impacts that we get from climate change, things that we cannot change. So most of the tropics are not the larger sources of greenhouse gases. Most of the greenhouse gases are being produced in the northern latitudes in more industrialized countries, in Europe, northern Asia, and in North America. But the blunt end of the stick of climate change is going to happen in the tropics, like we saw in that map. So there are a lot of things that we cannot change. Even if countries like Costa Rica would stop emitting greenhouse gases altogether tomorrow, we would still be getting the impacts that we saw in that map. Our yields will still go down even if we are not the ones producing the greenhouse gases. Why? Because this is a global effect. The whole production of greenhouse gases doesn't really matter where you produce them, they go into the whole atmosphere and the whole world is affected. So adaptation is how do we deal with these effects? And what tools can we use? We can diversify our production, for one. If we have many crops, we don't really know what effects we might have. I'll give you the example of Costa Rica, specifically Monteverde, where I live. Climate here has become very, very unpredictable. Before, it used to work like clockwork. When the Jihuiros, which is the national bird, started singing, the farmers knew that it was going to start raining and they would plant. Nowadays, the Jihuiros sing any time of the year and different times of the year. And then sometimes it rains when they sing, sometimes it doesn't rain when they sing. So it's very hard for small farmers to predict what's going to happen. Uh, if we have a lot of crops and you get a dry year and then you get a windy year, you might have a crop that resists these conditions, and the next year it might be really rainy and you have another crop for that condition. So diversifying instead of producing a few crops is one way of adapting to the variability that climate change is bringing to our farming. Uh, Trying to make local practices that adapt to the local consequences of climate change is important because every little place has its own way of manifesting climate change. Like I say here, climate is getting more variable, and we're also getting harder rainfall during our rainy season, like really hard downpours and really dry seasons. Before, climate here in Monteverde used to be more like kind of always like this misty drizzle falling all the time. Now we get lots of rain or no rain at all. An adaptation method is using greenhouses and hydroponics, and that's climate smart agriculture right there. That's a greenhouse here in Monteverde that produces a lot of the vegetables that are consumed around by hotels and locals. What they do is they are mitigating the effects of climate change because if it gets too dry, hydroponics uses very little water. If it gets too windy, they get protection from the wind from the greenhouse, and it also regulates the amount of water that falls on the plant. So if it rains really hard, you don't get fungus or anything else because you're controlling it. And these control conditions are an example of something that climate smart agriculture would do to adapt to climate change. Finally, self-sufficiency at a community level is encouraged by climate smart agriculture. If we depend a lot on imports of food, then we are susceptible to changes in the market that might come from climate change. And the idea that every community kind of produces a good portion of its own food makes it more resilient to any unpredictable changes that we might have in production in places where climate change is affecting grain production. Finally, the last pillar of climate smart agriculture is mitigation. This is addressing the causes of climate change. Remember, adaptation is addressing the effects. What do we do about all these things that are coming at us from climate change? But we also want to make sure that we're not contributing to the causes of climate change. So all these new climate smart agriculture techniques are geared to reducing the carbon footprint of agriculture. As you know, food production in the world is one of the main sources of greenhouse gases. We get methane from enteric fermentation in cows. We get a lot of nitrous oxide, a really harmful greenhouse gas from synthetic fertilizers going into the ground. And we get a lot of carbon dioxide when we clear forests and burn them to open up pastures and new farmland. So here you have a picture of a type of agriculture that is very common here in Costa Rica. This is coffee, but it's not just coffee. It also has a cover crop, which is a timber tree called laurel. Laurel is very good wood. So that laurel is fixing carbon in its wood and turning it into an extra product. So here you have diversification for adapting to climate change, but you also have mitigation because you're fixing carbon. So a farm like this might actually reduce its emissions by having all these trees incorporated into the farm. And here you have some tools, mitigation technology like biodigesters. You already saw a video about that. Uh, Increasing agrobiodiversity, like you can see here, incorporating trees into your farms, managing your soils, reducing synthetic fertilizers can go a long way in reducing your farming carbon footprint. And maximizing feedback loops. What does that mean? That means that instead of buying fertilizer that produces a lot of nitrous oxide when it dissipates and also is creates a lot of emissions when it's created, you can use your own manure from your own animals. These are emissions that you were already giving out, but instead of just wasting them, you're using them, and these chemicals are getting absorbed again by your plants and giving you an extra product. So you're turning your waste into a profit by closing these cycles in your farm. And finally, reducing your energy consumption. Remember that climate smart agriculture is not just for the tiny little farm homestead that's producing its own food. It also goes for industrial production of crops like sugarcane. A sugarcane plantation can save a lot of energy by using the waste from its sugarcane and using it to power itself. Like you can generate electricity from all the bagasse or the waste that comes out from extracting the sugar from the plant. You burn this and you can generate electricity. You can also reduce fuel consumption for your tractors, for your machinery. You can use solar energy. You can use biodigesters to provide your own energy. So there are many ways of mitigating the effects that we're already having on the environment due to food production. So here are some practices that are encouraged by climate smart agriculture, and it's definitely not limited to this. But what I want to show you is that there are a lot of options out there. It's a very broad spectrum of options that you can get. So things from crop production improvements to integrated practices like, for example, you can integrate your fish into your rice paddies and increase your productivity. You go to high-tech solutions like genetic resources, genetic engineering, and nuclear techniques where you are actually dividing and the nucleus and manipulating the DNA within your crops. to things like preventing how do you control your pests without using so many chemicals, or how you improve the diet of your livestock. It's really broad. One thing that I would like to highlight is that climate smart agriculture is a paradigm of food production that is not looking into a lot of things that we consider sustainability. It's concentrated mostly on climate and not harming the people that are uh, doing the farming. What do I mean by this? That there are practices that might be frowned upon by sustainability movements, like transgenic crops, for example, or the ethics of having livestock in confined spaces, or using synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. Climate smart agriculture is trying to incorporate these things and looking at what works, whether it's synthetic or natural, but what works to be less impactful on the climate while increasing productivity. Finally, there is a tool online from the UN to kind of help farmers get this technology. So the idea is that they can get all these techniques and put them into practice by learning about them. And getting this from the university level to the on the field ground level is very hard. It's a big challenge, but nowadays with internet, you can do that. And there are a lot of tools that are available for farmers that are very simple to use that allow them to access technology like satellite imagery, or connect them to NGOs that can help them apply all these high-tech solutions that climate smart agriculture promotes. So we're going to stop here, and this is the first part of this lecture. We're going to continue with what agriculture's role in Costa Rica's carbon neutrality plans are. So thank you, and I'll see you in a while.